Hello and welcome to another edition of the Pointcast with me, Liu Xin. And today we're talking about a topic we haven't touched upon substantively for a long time, which is India. And the reason why I want to talk about this, I want to get this out of my way. The reason why I want to talk about this, because India is such an important country, is very weighty in all senses, and it's a very important neighbor of China. So I think we have to talk about India. We have to understand what is happening, what India is doing, what other countries are doing with India, and what are the potential ramifications, especially at this very uncertain period of time. So let's dedicate quite some time for a longish conversation, if I can make it interesting to you. And for that purpose, I have a new guest, which is appearing on our show for the very first time. Mao Keji, Associate Analyst at the International Cooperation Center of NDRC, or China's National Development and Reform Commission. He is also a visiting fellow at Harvard Yenching Institute. So, Keji, it's a great pleasure to have you on the show for the very first time. Thank you for making time for this.
Thank you. It's my honor to be here with you.
It's our great honor to have you. You have actually dedicated almost all of your academic time on the studies of India. Tell us a bit about what you have been doing and where your research focus is, because people don't really know so much what you're doing, especially on the Chinese social media. You have a newsletter called the South Asia Studies Newsletter, which is very diligent. I mean, every day, loads of stuff coming out, and very solid follower, very loyal followers. Tell us a bit of what you're doing vis-a-vis India.
Sure. I regard myself as a specialist in South Asia study. For sure, India is the largest nation in the region. So basically, I will concentrate like 80% of my energy on India, and the rest 20% for other South Asia economies. I've been doing newsletter thing for quite a while, for the past 5 years. So every day we view a lot of different news from South Asia and edit them into short letters and sending them to the Chinese community. Basically translate and edit different kind of messages and sharing them with the Chinese audiences. So I believe South Asia is one of the most important region in the world, given its population. But given the fact that we have very limited, uh, information access to the local news, so I believe we are doing something that's meaningful, which is to increase the mutual understanding between the Chinese people and the people in South Asia.
Absolutely. I think it is so critical that we understand each other better. There are a lot of misunderstanding, I would say, both ways. And situation had been evolving in all kinds of senses, the relationship between India and the United States, the relationship between India and China, and, the impact of, obviously, of the war in Iran on India's foreign policy and on these relations. So these are the three major blocks, let's say, I want to touch upon during this conversation. I believe they're all interconnected, and the changes are kind of, woven together, affecting the dynamic of everything that concerns India. So let's start. I would say from a news perspective, everybody would like to know the very latest. So when it comes to the war, of course, that's the war in Iran. What is India's position on this war, and how is India being impacted by what's happening in the Middle East?
Well, I think it's to be very honest, and it's quite accurate and dramatic moment for India for now. Yeah, because we all know that Prime Minister Modi visited Israel almost like 2 day or 3 day before the breaking out of the war.
Yeah.
Which almost seemed like an endowment of the war. If you know anything, then you still visit it there, right? uh, it sent out a very very accurate signal to the global community that India sided with Israel right before the war. So, but given the fact that India has always value the term strategic autonomy or some kind of neutrality, right? So, being sided with Israel in such a moment actually appeared to be quite accurate given India's traditional foreign policy position. That's the first thing. The second thing, India can be one of the global economy that's hurted, worst by the war, because India is so dependent on the oil and gas coming out from the Gulf.
Hmm.
And given the fact that there's also a big Indian community, diaspora community in the Middle East, so the war will for sure sending out a very, very harmful shock to Indian economy. And I think I will elaborate that point later in today's session, because if you pay any attention to Indian economy, you may find that oil price or gas price or the energy price is actually the single most important factor for Indian economy. So when the price of energy goes up, there will be problems almost simultaneously for different economic indicators like the inflation, trade deficit, physical deficit. So if the oil price or gas price goes up, all those deficits just appear simultaneously. So I mean, they do nothing, then they suffer from this hike of the price. So it's kind of almost helpless position there, like many other countries. But India is of extra vulnerability because its dependence on the Gulf oil is actually very high. Yeah.
Mm. So you used two words, awkward and dramatic. Um, tell us a little bit more about the relationship between India and Israel, because Prime Minister Modi made actually some very strong statements. For instance, he was talking about India being the motherland, Israel being the fatherland for Jews of Indian origin. So there is obviously a historical origin there for that kind of closeness of relationship. But on the other hand, India also has a very long relationship with Persia, with Iran, with the Iranian people or a certain section of the Iranian people. I was just talking to some Indian friends last night over dinner, and he was telling me when in his family, the only language that his father's father could communicate with his mother's father, the maternal family, the only language that they could talk to each other, understand each other in, was Persian. So India and Iran also has a very strong relationship. So, how delicate is the situation there?
Well, that is a very good question. So traditionally, India has been siding with Arabic nations and Iran for almost all its history after the independence, because it's kind of like Israel was regarded as kind of pawn of the imperialists. So India has been sided with Arabic countries and Iran for a very long time. So that's the traditional position. But there was some change after BJP, which is the party of Prime Minister Modi, came to power in 2014. So the BJP came to power with an ideology called Hindu nationalism. So which is, in nature, a religion nationalism. So it's based on religion. So, basically, if that is the idea, then Muslim people who believe in Islam is regarded as a kind of, it's a kind of common enemy for all those people inside of India. So that was used as a rally flag inside domestically. So in that sense, there was a very big domestic constituent, voter base, they really love Israel because they believe those were the fighters who were against the Islamic invaders, something like that. So basically, it's kind of politically popular for Prime Minister Modi to have closer relations with Israel. And given the fact that India had some uneasy relations with its neighboring Muslim country like Pakistan or Bangladesh. So in all those conflicts, Israel sided with India quite closely, providing India with very, very advanced weapons and like espionage equipments and all those like battlefield technologies. All of those were very, very advanced, very, very helpful for India's war efforts. So, by doing all those kind of cooperation or coordination, they developed a very, very close relations over the past decade. So that was a relatively new development, given the fact that India's traditional position was more sided with Arabic countries than Iran. So, but on the other hand, we all know that there were a lot of Indian diaspora, migrant workers in Middle East. So that means India has to have a relatively balanced relations with either side of the conflict in the Middle East. So that was quite delicate, right? You have to keep it very, very balanced. Otherwise, you will suffer from both sides. So, given that kind of relations, given that the balance, it's quite awkward for Prime Minister Modi to visit Israel right before the war. So that's why I said it was an awkward moment. Yeah. And because of the visit, Prime Minister Modi also faced quite strong criticism from the opposite party. Yeah.
But the economic impact is actually quite strong, as you mentioned, because for India, energy prices almost reflect instantly on the indicators of the economy. What have there been indications, because we are already 20 days into this, more than 20 days into this war, have there been indicators of the Indian economy that are direct result of the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz?
Yeah, there are a lot, quite a lot of phenomena there. I would say it's a crisis. It's a crisis, almost disaster for India. Yeah, so I've heard that there were some friends still in India. My Indian friends, they told me that restaurant, they've a lot of restaurant, they run out of business because of the shortage of the energy fuel. Basically, it's LNG, natural gas, because running out of natural gas. So a lot of restaurant, they stop their service, and there were kind of electricity shortage as well, because many of those power plants, they are based on natural gas. So I think that will be quite disastrous for economy like India. And there are also some other side effect besides the energy. For example, the fertilizers, because India is depends so much on the fertilizers coming from Middle East. So because of the closure of the street, then there is a shortage right now. And we know spring is the season for growing the plants, right? If you don't have the fertilizers at the right time, you will suffer for the entire year. So this is a very critical moment, but India is still in a like very, very serious lack of the fertilizers.
Fertilizer. So can we extrapolate that India actually didn't have much oil reserve, or it was not planning, or was not preparing for the rainy days when traffic was flowing? So it didn't believe in strategic reserve of energy, of crude oil, or it just ran out of it?
I mean, India, the Indian government has been paying quite a lot of attention to strategic reserve, because there's always like emergency moment there for many times, since the Cold War. So there is strategic reserve for sure. But given the fact that India is such a large country and it's relatively not that rich yet, so basically it has like more limited space for holding such large amount of the like crude oil reserve, like
I
Japan
see.
or Canada
Mm,
or even the
mm,
US. And we know that India is a country of very very few like oil underground. So basically all its oil coming from outside of India. But there's something very ironic. So you know it's quite ironic that the largest single item that India exports to the global market is actually refined oil. So even if it does not has oil underground, it
it
has
makes
a
the
very,
difference. It profit from the difference from the.
yeah, it profits from processing the oil it imported from Middle East. Then we
Mm,
sell it to global market for
mm,
profit.
mm.
So because of that capacity, India has actually some extra layer of protection. So basically, if you want to sell it to the global market, now you're not selling them anymore. So you will have some commercial reserve there, which is not intended for domestic market at first place. But
Mm,
at the moment, you can still use those, right? Because you're holding them.
right.
So basically, in the west coast of India, like Gujarat and Maharashtra, there are a lot of refineries, like commercial refineries for global market.
Mm,
So they have quite a lot of the commercial reserve, which are quite useful. So you can regard them as part of the strategic reserve because you can always change the purpose. Yeah, that's
very
something
interesting.
quite interesting. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah. What can India do, or what is India doing to help alleviate the situation? It needs energy so desperately, right? The war doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. Is India trying to, I don't know, get energy somewhere else, import more, or trying to mediate, trying to help bring an earlier end to the conflict? What is India trying to do at this moment?
Well, so there are at least three parts, you know, from my answer to your question. So the first part is, in contrast to country like Japan, South Korea, like other like Eastern Asian economies, India has one huge advantage, which is its relations with Russia. So India traditionally was not a big buyer of Russian oil, but after the Ukraine crisis, it became one. So that was actually, an opportunity offered by accident, right? Because of the Ukraine crisis, India became a Russian oil buyer. So now the war in Iran happened. Then India has extra kind of channels. They can still import oil from Russia.
Hmm.
And I believe the Trump government recently kind of give Modi government a green light for Russian oil, so to keep global oil price at a reasonable level. So it has got a green light. So that was good news. So that's the first layer. But
Mm,
if you Japan or South Korea, given its relations with Russia, they're still facing some extra difficulties, right? Because they are still protesting against the Ukraine war. So for them, it's quite uneasy to buy those Russian oil and the
mm,
European countries for sure. So that's the first layer. The second layer. So in contrast to country like China, India is in a very disadvantageous position because it has a very very difficulty like geostrategic position or geographic position. So it's really hard to have overland pipeline linking India with the oil countries. So even if China cannot get oil from Gulf for now, it still has a lot of pipeline oil from either Russia or Central Asia and some even from Myanmar. Right? There's pipeline. China has been building those for the past decade. But in India, it's really hard. If you want to connect to Middle East, you have to go through Pakistan we all know the relations between Pakistan and India is quite difficulty. So it's almost impossible, right? Yeah. For the third part of the answer, the electronification of green energy has been rising in recent years in India, but its absolute volume is not still that significant. So, China appeared to be quite calm so far. One big reason behind that is the fact that China is the greatest producer for e-vehicle and for the solar panels and the wind turbine, wind farms. Right? China was the single largest producers for all those green energy products. So it gave China an extra layer of safety or the energy safety. Yeah. So basically, India is in position which is actually better position than Japan and South Korea, but less advantages in comparison to China. Yeah, that's the thing.
I see. In terms of mediation or helping, bring out a political solution to the crisis, what role is India playing, if at all? It obviously has certain advantage. I mean, giving its relationship to Israel, for instance, whether India is playing any role on its own or as part of the BRICS, because the very latest conversation between Iranian leaders and the Indian leader is about encouraging the BRIC mechanism to be more constructive, to be more active. So what do you know? What can you tell us about that from these fronts?
Yeah, I've seen, Prime Minister Modi has made several phone calls with Iranian leadership. And I can tell that they are very, very kind of enthusiasm about making the deals or helping to making peace between the sides in the different side of the conflict. They really want to do something like that, but I doubt that they got the ability or capacity to do that, because India has kind of they really want to do something good for the region, for the globe, but I doubt they have that capacity because they kind of lost quite a bit of their credibility from the Iranian side. You visit Israel like several days before the war,
Of course.
right? It just looked like an endorsement for the war. Also, U.S. has been asking India for the logistic support using the Indian ports. And India was happy about the commercial deals because they can make profit by supporting the U.S. Navy in the region. So if you want to be a friend of US in such a critical moment, then it's really hard for you to say something with really high credibility in front of Iranian leadership, right? You can make some deals about letting your ships passing the street. That's fine. But if you want to make peace, then it actually, I believe, needs more, higher level of credibility than that. So I believe there's certain difficulties behind that.
So basically, its close relationship with Israel is a liability at this moment in terms of its potential ability to help bring about a political solution. What about within the BRICS mechanism? By the way, I want to particularly emphasize this because when I did another show about the Strait of Hormuz, I did it with Mr. Zhao Hai, who is also a longtime friend and a great commentator. But we didn't really emphasize, we didn't really talk much about the BRICS mechanism. And I got a comment, a feedback saying, you didn't even mention a word about, BRICS because Iran is part of the BRICS. So how realistic, how much can we expect BRICS to play a bigger role? Because, these times is a test of your hard power. And BRICS is not a military alliance. The countries that make up BRICS, because they do not agree with using force, they want to talk about consensus, right? They are against intervention. So is there something that BRICS can do? And because India is the chair of BRICS this year, potentially what can,
the fact that India is the chair of the BRICS makes the whole situation even more accurate, I believe. I mean, if interestingly, if you look at the strike last year, so the U.S. and Israel struck the Iranian nuclear nuclear facilities last year, right? So for that a strike, actually, BRIC released an announcement against that. So I believe there will be something coming up like that in the future, but I believe it will be actually more difficult this time, given the fact that so because India,
Of course, I
if you
understand. Yeah,
consider
now that you
India's
explained it.
position, yeah, because if you're giving India's position, it's really hard to choosing a side for now because everything is still very uncertain. So if India sided with, for say, BRICS or Iran, then after certain like upsolves, then it was Israel and the U.S. who actually conclude the conflict as the winning side. Then it would be quite awkward, even more awkward for India, right? Because it's sided with the losing side. So because there's very very great uncertainty out there,
I
it's really
understand.
hard for India to make the decision. And so India has to keep its own opinion, you know, for some distance from the Chinese position, the Russian position in BRICS. Otherwise, it will make it looks like kind of it's too close to Russia and China, which is very harmful for its relations with the U.S. So because of the fear of alienate with the U.S., so India will always keep a kind of more balanced position, but which is really really bad for the BRICS to reach the consensus because of India's opinion.
Since you mentioned the dynamics of U.S.-India relationship, let's talk about that. Um, I remember when President Trump first came into power, during his first term, we were receiving some Indian strategic thinkers and scholars. I remember Mr. Ashley Tellis was among them. Actually, I received them in my studio and we had a chat, and they were feeling very promising. They were feeling pretty good that they think that President Trump coming into power is good news for India. Now we are 1 year into President Trump's second term. Where are we in terms of India-US relations?
So, do you know something happened to Mr. Ashley Tellis?
I heard. Yeah, I heard
Yeah.
something really
So,
unfortunate.
yeah. So that's a signal. So if someone like Ashley Tellis something that negative happened to him, then that means there's something wrong with Indian US. I should not say the word wrong, but there's something really different.
Different. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, from the relations between those two big powers. So it has been quite different from the previous period of time. I would say it's dramatically different. So for many years, a lot of people believe Indian and the US, they are natural allies, right? They're natural friends, natural partners, because both of them, hold kind of like fear or kind of suspicion against China. So their common suspicions or fear against China make them best friend. So in order to hedge the rise of China, so-called, then US has to help India. That was the idea behind, pretty much. So that was the idea behind the Indo-Pacific strategy, right? So, but there's something, for Trump administration for the second term, something changed dramatically. So for the Trump second, India is no longer regarded as a partner.
Why not?
Because I believe it's my theory, right? I have a theory for that. So I believe in the conflict between China and the US, China has already won. So China is now the first power the most dominant, the hegemonic, the dominant power in the ranking. So China is the first one. So US
You mean
has
in Asia or around the world? And
around the
why do you
world.
say that?
Yeah,
Why do
around the world. That's my opinion, and I have some supports for that.
Go ahead,
Okay,
tell us more,
okay.
because
Yeah,
without understanding this,
yeah,
we
if you
won't
look
be able to
at it
understand your
from the
theory.
okay, so in the era of globalization, many people don't pay attention to a lot of very, very critical indicators, economic indicators, which China has a huge advantages, like generation of electricity, like the production of steel, like the
Mhm.
production of like plastics, like the production of the shipbuilding capacities, like the ability to build nuclear reactors. So in the era of globalization, people don't really pay much attention. Oh, for sure, critical minerals. People don't really pay attention to those, real stuff. They
What
pay,
about, yeah, what about, per capita GDP? I'm just being a devil's advocate
well,
here.
yeah, it's a very good and a very useful indicators, but it's limited. So when, if you look at the Ukraine crisis, right? If there's war going on, the GDP is country on the GDP per capita is not a really good indicator for your work capacity and for the capacity to sustain yourself
Mhm.
economically and politically, right? So if we judge by those very, very important indicators, China is absolutely number one in the ranking, I believe. So when you pay attention to shipbuilding capacity, when you pay attention to
Right.
electricity, when you pay attention to all those very important industrial indicators, China is absolutely number one, right? Even given the AI, we know in nature AI is based on your energy, right? So the more energy you have, the denser, the higher density of the energy you have, the more AI capacity you will have. China is for sure the number one energy power in the world, and it has a lot of industrial capacity to produce even more solar panels, wind farms, and all those nuclear reactors.
Right.
So by saying that, I mean, if you look at those critical indicators, industrial indicators, China is absolutely the number one. And those things also means work capacity, even if you don't want to use them, right? Okay, so if China is the number one and the US is the number two, so the conflict for the US is not the first position in the system, it's the second position. Because you've lost your first position. So now you need to defend your second position. So the scenario becomes who is gonna to be the greatest threat to my second position in the system, right?
India.
Yeah, it's not Japan, it's not Germany, it will be India, given its population, given its ambition, right? So India will be the most likely candidate for the number two position besides the US.
But some people are actually saying the US is still trying to compete with China, right? It has China all over its eyes and its dream about China. It's like China is its worst nightmare. We have to, compete with China. It seems it's all talk about China. Why do you say the US is actually turning attention um, to contain, let's say, India's growth? Is
Yeah,
that is that too much of a theory, or is it really slowly becoming a kind of
so
consensus among at least think tanks?
I mean, it's not my own opinion. A lot of very, very senior US officials also support my point of view. So if you look at the regional dialogue happening in India recently, I think it's like 3 weeks ago, something like that. There was a very, very high level, U.S. official from State Department who said exactly the thing I said. I don't remember the name, but it was quite a hit, few weeks ago. Basically, he said that the U.S. won't make mistake again. U.S. won't help another China, which is India, to rise in the Chinese style. So basically, if U.S. still holds the very first position, If its dominance is very stable, I believe the decision makers from Washington D.C. won't say something like that, right? Because they are so confident that they are number one. If only if they hold some doubt about themselves, then they will be so fearful of the rise of India. So basically, they treat India kind of more harshly because they are concerned about rise of India will be a big challenge to the U.S. position in the global system. So now is the battle for number two position.
What is President Trump's idea about U.S. relations with India? I mean, you were talking about some administration officials, but President Trump, famously, he has his own mind sometimes. So, of course, he has been straightforward when it comes to relations with India. He would just say
Well,
what's on his mind. So, what is he thinking?
so let's see some numbers. President Trump never mentioned Indo-Pacific, the strategy of Indo-Pacific in his second term. He never mentioned that idea in public occasions. No.
So the idea is not on his mind.
No, the idea of Indo-Pacific is almost dying because President himself never mentioned it in the second term. Why? Because Trump believed such a group was a vehicle for countries like Japan, Australia, India to ask US to make more contribution, to ask US to make more sacrifice for those allies and partners. So it's a bad business for the US because all people ask US to contribute more. That's why Mr. President just abandoned the idea because US is losing money from all those kind of mechanisms.
Was also probably the legacy of the previous administration.
Yeah, so
isn't it?
But ironically, it was Trump himself who started the very idea of Indo-Pacific in the very first term. So there's a big change of mind. Very interesting. So traditionally, U.S. regarded its allies and partners as a kind of tool or as a pawn against the rise of China, right? If you want to use them as a tool, then you have to subsidize them. You have to treat them well. Then they will be helping you, right? It's a mutual, right? You treat them well and they do something for you, which is go against China. Now, Mr. President Trump is very worried about decline of the U.S. That's why he's keeping saying make U.S. great again. If we read between the lines, that means U.S. is not as good as before, right? So because if you want to save the U.S., you want to save every penny from your business. Then you want your allies and partners to make contribution to you instead of you go and help them, subsidize them. They want the allies and partners to, give U.S. investment to buy U.S. product in unfair price. So now they regard those people as their like black blood bag, because you're in a not a very good health condition. Now you need your friend, allies, and partners to contribute back to you. So that's why Trump has been using tools like tariff to treat its allies with kind of not so friendly like rhetoric. And that's a quite dramatic change of the strategy if you think about it, right? So basically, in the traditional way, U.S. U.S. has been using its allies to go against China, so it subsidized them. Now they want their allies and friends, their partners, to subsidize the U.S. because U.S. had the hard power which can coerce them to make those contributions. So if that is the case, then the relations between, Japan, Europe, even Canada, Australia with the US that's why it's in such low kind of level, or it's some very big dramatic change over there. That's my theory, and it explains a lot of things so far. I think people may disagree with me, but I have very very kind of good record for making the predictions.
Wow. So what is, may I ask, what would be the one example? What did you predict, and what actually happened, or what are you predicting about the future?
Yeah, for the record, when Prime Minister Moody visited Washington, D.C. in February 2025, I made the prediction that, the relations between U.S. and India would be very, very bad. Because, why said that? Because I view the concluding statement of the visit. I find that U.S. did not want to give any substantial kind of concession to India, while
Mm,
India was not willing to kind of bear any substantial kind of contribution making to the Trump administration. So it turned out that the tariff against India was one of the highest from the Trump administration,
mm,
and yeah, so I made that a prediction. It was pretty
yeah.
good. Yeah.
What is the a big prediction you're making about the future? Have you won such prediction?
I think if there's one I'm going to make, India will be a very, very important player in the global, community. But India has missed the strategic opportunity to catch up, to make the economic takeoff. Because India's relations with China, I would say, yeah. So
Let's talk about that. Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about that. We have finally come to this part. So there has been a tumultuous development of relationship, the Galwan Valley, and then the two governments decided to reset this relationship. And now it seems that things continue to be on a relatively stable path. Where are we, if you're going to characterize, if you're going to assess bilateral ties?
well, I believe the bilateral ties has been recovering from the rock bottom. It has been recovering, but I believe like there's a certain thing will be there, and it's really hard to get rid of in the foreseeable future. Because
Which
of the
is?
which is the ill treatment of the Chinese businessmen, of the Chinese companies, and with the suspicions against the Chinese business community in India, and the ill treatment or abuse of the Chinese business interests in India. Those things has left almost a permanent scar. So it's really hard to get rid of in the foreseeable future. So before this session, before 2020, India had been one of the most popular destiny for Chinese foreign direct investment. It has been like that for almost 10 years. But now, if you ask Chinese business community, they will be very, very suspicious about the idea of investment in India, because they've seen so many bad kind of episodes since 2020, right? So Moody government basically shut down almost like 400, 500 Chinese like apps, apps, overnight,
Hmm.
and never give a very plausible explanation afterwards, even not now.
Do you
So
see
yeah.
sorry for interrupting. Do you see bilateral ties recovering slightly? Because it seems that bilateral trade at least increased over 10% last year to some kind of a record high of 150 billion US dollars, almost on par to that between the US and India.
Well, there are two sides. So you don't need to have a very warm relations to have a very large volume of trade, right? So sometimes you import and export because you have to. India wants to industrialize its own economy. India wants to modernize its own economy by doing by if you want to do those things, you have to import a lot of facilities. You have to import a lot of equipment, tools, and intermediate ingredients from China, right? You
Mm,
have to do those because China is the best place you can, import with the best price. So even if you hate China, you can still import things from China. So I
If you
think
have
that's
to.
separate. That's separate.
Mm.
But on the other hand, by having a such large volume of trade, actually makes Indian society even more concerned about the Chinese. You don't like them, but you import a lot from them, then you just became more concerned. It's strategically kind of, it's really hard to express, that kind of feeling. You have to use those things, but you don't really want to use them.
Mm.
So I mean, sometimes you that's kind of, no, now I think it's more about mentality. So China, for sure, it's the pioneer for industrialization for big economy of more than 1 billion population. So in that sense, China is the best teacher or the best kind of, guide for India to do a lot of things. But at the same time, India, they have a very, very deep suspicion against the Chinese way of development. So, for them, it's really uneasy to accept the Chinese way of development. If you look at China, right? China had been have a very, very huge trade deficit with South Korea, Japan, and the province of Taiwan for many, many years. The reason was very simple because those economies they were pioneers, right? China was latecomer, so for latecomer, it's very, very natural to have a big trade deficit.
Deficit.
Yeah, but for India, it's really easy to harbor that deficit, and they always try to make it a political concern,
Mm.
which is unnecessary, I believe, because if you want to politicize that, it will make your business even harder because there's always a domestic audience trying to have a hard line against Chinese business, right? So if you ask a Chinese company if they think going to India is a good idea, if it's 5 years or 6 years ago, they will say, okay, yeah, it's a good idea. Now, if you ask them, they will say, oh, I don't think it's a good idea because the Indian government is so
Well,
unfriendly.
well, two things. Two things. How much has the mentality among Chinese people toward India, even toward Indians, changed as a result of all of the things that you mentioned? How is there any chance that that mentality can, loosen up a little bit, that there is another chance for, closer engagement with the other side? This is first question. And secondly, do you think the relaxation of business visa rules by India and vice versa by China, is that going anywhere? Is that doing any good?
Well, I believe it's really hard to, make the Chinese audiences to change their mind for now because there's really, really hard. It's really hard for Indian government for domestic political reason to, to back off their kind of hostile position against Chinese business, against Chinese investment. You know, it's almost because you have such a big heavy reliance over China, then you will always be very fearful. Then this fear will actually makes your position even kind of make your action looks quite suspicious to the domestic audiences. So that's why we don't see a lot of change, even if there's a change of policy. We don't see, the fundamental kind of the idea changed quite dramatically from the Indian side. They are still very, very strategically suspicious of the Chinese, even if they have to use the Chinese investment and they have to use the Chinese capital. If that doesn't change, I think it's really hard to change from Chinese side because we've never seen an apology, because they've never apologized for their shutdown of the Chinese company overnight, which is quite ironic or kind of, US has been talking about shut down TikTok for a very long time,
And it
but it
didn't.
never happened, right? It never happened for real. But they shut down TikTok in India overnight. They arrested people, the Chinese citizen, some of them overnight. Then they just shut down the company. So they just kicked them out for very, very accurate reason. It's like a national safety or something. Then they never apologized for that. And they did not apologize that not because they don't want to, but because there's domestic political pressure over them. So if that kind of pressure exists from the Indian side, it's really hard for the Chinese side to change their mind because they never receive an apology. That's my observation because I'm following Indian news every day, so I can sense that kind of feeling. So as for the one you mentioned, the business visa, I think they're certainly very good. For the bilateral relations, they're at least a positive change, from the Indian side.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that's just one step. It's a very positive development, but just one step. We need something more. We need actually more substantial step than that. Yeah, that's my observation.
Yeah. Well, I think we always have to, be hopeful and try to, do the right thing. I'm going to read out this paragraph from the Chinese president vis-a-vis in relations between Beijing and Delhi. This was given out in January of this year, when he talked about Beijing and Delhi being good friends, good neighbors, friends, and partners, as the two Asian giants continue to improve ties. In the wake of the great economic turbulence, the trade turbulence. On India's Republic Day, the Chinese president wished his Indian counterpart, sent his Indian counterpart congratulations and said that China-India relations have continued to improve and develop and are of great significance for maintaining and promoting world peace and prosperity. So, to wrap up, it was a bit heavy what we were talking about. Any bright side that we can keep some hopes alive in this relationship?
Sure, of course, people to people exchange has always been very important, right? There's there are a whole bunches of Indian vlog people, YouTubers. They came to China, they suddenly find China is not like what they've been thinking. China is so futuristic. China is so advanced. Then they turn out to really love China, and I believe more exchange like that will always be very helpful to for improving the bilateral relations. And I believe China and India are like two largest economies in the world. There will always be great potential that we can try to exploit it. Yeah. I'm very helpful. That's why still doing this. If it's not that helpful, I will just quit. Yeah. So yeah, I'm very helpful. Don't worry.
Good. Well, I'm happy to hear that. Thank you so much. I've just been listening. Today I'm just listening. I'm really curious, and I think I learned a lot. Of course, yeah, and I hope this has been helpful and useful to our viewers. So I welcome comments, and I don't know how people are going to find it useful, at least. But I have to say this is Mr. Mao Keji's opinion. So we would welcome, right? We'll welcome different voices, and so that we have a different perspective and maybe even a debate. But for now, let's think about this and try to grab a better understanding of the big picture. Thank you so much, Mao Keji, Associate Analyst at the International Cooperation Center of NDRC, China's National Development and Reform Commission, and also Visiting Fellow at Harvard Yenching Institute. Thank you, really.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here with you. I hope I will be here again next time.
Absolutely. Now that I've had the first experience, which is very positive, I will be calling on you.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
谢谢。
拜拜，再见。